So in this afternoon session, we have Boštjan Nedoh from ZRC SAZU and Adrian Johnston. The first will be Boštjan, who is actually the organizer of this nice conference and research fellow at the Institute of Philosophy. He's the author of the book Ontology and Perversion, Agamben, Deleuze, Lacan, if I remember correctly. And guess what? He didn't publish any Slovenian books yet, so his talk, today's talk is probably, I suspect, part of a project on a Slovenian book which is supposed to be published in the autumn this year. Yeah? Yeah.
Well, yeah, the book is going to be published in the autumn. But
Boštjan works on the many problematics and topics, Agamben, biopolitics, etc. Then recently he started these topics he's going to talk about today, about superego and transgression and law and etc. So I think I'm already too long, so Boštjan, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Peter. This is probably not going to be a part of my hopefully first book in my mother tongue, which is, hopefully going to be published sometimes in the autumn. Nevertheless, it's, how should I say, it's a paper extracted from a pretty long paper, which has in its original pretty long version almost the same title, the Superego and Jouissance of Transgression, and deals with, in the first part, with the paradigms of the superego, which I'm trying to develop kind of along, but not in a chronological sense of Miller's paradigm of Jouissance. And in the second half or third, the original paper has this analysis of one of the most popular crime series running in the US, which depicts a special unit of Chicago Police Department. But so I warn you in advance, it's going to be probably a confused paper, but I'm happy to address any unclearness in the Q&A session. So let me begin. When on 6 January 2021, the supporters of the former US President Donald Trump broke into the US Capitol in Washington, D.C. A large part of the media attention went to the now famous bison named Jake Agnelli. But what immediately attracted the media attention, not only of the US but also of the foreign public, was not the subsequently revealed fact that Agnelli had regularly attended Trump rallies before the Capitol incident, and even less that his nickname was QAnon Shaman, and he was therefore a recognizable figure of probably the most influential conspiracy theory movement today, but his eccentric outfit. The upper part of his body was covered only by a fur hat with 2 horns, while his beard supposedly signaled that he was imitating a bison and not a buffalo, as some had initially surmised. The first and most important contrast or ambivalence was already evident in the combination of the mentioned hat and the US flag painted on his face. Why? The attributes of the bison symbolize American wilderness, so the space historically belonging to the Native Americans, while Agnelli's face, painted in the colors of the US flag is, in this context, symbolized the so-called white supremacy. The latter is not only one of the main identities of the supporters of Trump's MAGA project, but from the historical perspective, represents precisely the political and social force that committed so-called ethnocide against the native population. How then should we understand this, at least at first sight, unusual and ambiguous symbolic combination of two historically opposed futures, the bison attire and the US flag? The central part of the answer will take two seemingly surprising but closely connected detours. And I'm condensing the very long paper. So the first part will be on what I'm trying to develop under the title of the paradigms of the superego, and in the second part I will try to give you just a hint of many, many examples of dialogues running in the series I just mentioned. So if I anticipate a bit the point I will try to develop in what follows, I can say that the transgression of the law or prohibition based on the logic of the superego is the one that, as Todd McGowan puts it, enables an active subject to assume through self-instrumentalization a place of the protector of the very same law that they, he, she, it, constantly break through transgression. The subject that transgresses the legal prohibition in the topological place of jouissance, which in his seminar 7 Lacan called evil, based on Desart's turn of Kant, considers their action to be a heroic sacrifice for the restoration of law and order. And as I will try to show, if there is any connection between two histories, I'm not making here a direct connection, but just a correlation between some of the main features. So between two historically so different movements as MAGA on the one hand and Nazism on the other hand, then this common feature is related precisely to the logic of the superego and the transgression of the law in the name of its preservation. And this logic relies, as I will try to show, on a specific superegoic dialectic between the dirty and the necessary. This is why we'll first delineate the main conceptual emphasis set up by Freud and Lacan about the superego, and as I just said, I will try to then to give you just a hint running one episode highlight of the series. So, as far as Freud is concerned, the concept of the superego belongs to the period of metapsychology, as we all know, receiving its most precise and exhaustive elaborations, especially in the essays Group Psychology and the Analysis of the Ego from 1921, The Ego and the Id from 23, The Economic Problem of Masochism from 24, and Civilization and its Discontents from 1930. There, Freud defines the superego through various definitions, some of which are compatible with one another, while some of them are contradictory. These definitions stretch from superego being conceived as a moral conscious, parental voice, later becoming a moral voice of other social authorities, the quote-unquote here of Kant's categorical imperative, the unconscious sense of guilt, etc., etc. However, there is one constant persisting. The large majority of these Freud's definitions of the superego. In fact, as Todd McGowan has noted this very well, the latter is in most cases conceived as the internal or subjective representative of external law. The law is defined as a set of prohibitions constraining subjects' natural inclinations conceived by Kant as pathological, whereby superego functions as law affective representative in the subject, assuring that the latter actually obeys the law toward which would he otherwise remain indifferent. Freud expressions such as for superego, psychic being a psychic tribunal, here of Kant's categorical imperative attributed to the superego seems to confirm this conception. Although Lacan made some steps further with respect to Freud's conception of the superego, it can be said that, at least in his early phase of his teaching, he initially kept the conception of the superego as internal or affective representative of external law. For example, it is telling that Lacan opens his seminar on ethics of psychoanalysis with the problem of the sense of the feeling, of the sense, that is inherently and inextricably connected with the superego, and this is, of course, the sense of guilt. When he talks about the quote-unquote attraction of guilt, about its omnipresence and being something worthy of our praise, happiness of guilt, felix culpa, insofar as it is precisely guilt, quote, to which the realm of civilization owes its development, he thereby refers to the constitutive relation between guilt and symbolic law as prohibition, which Freud analyzes in his Totem and Taboo. And I'm not recalling here the story that we basically all know, so about the murder of the father of the primal horde, and the limitation put to the enjoyment set by the emergence of the symbolic law. I will rather just cut a long story short, I would like to define the first two paradigms of the superego that consist of conceiving the sense of guilt, which revolves around these dialectics between law and its transgression. So I think it can be said that the sense of guilt consists first as sorry. I lost the piece of paper. So consists first as a kind of affective correlate, assurance that make sure the subjects doesn't transgress the boundary set up by the symbolic law as a prohibition. And the second paradigm, which is obviously dialectically related to the first one, is that which burdens the subjects with the sense of guilt for such transgressions. Let me just find the right sheet of paper. Now, apart from these two first paradigms of the superego, which revolves around these dialectics between law and transgression and implies the sense of guilt. Obviously, later in Seminar 20, Lacan turned this basic definition of the superego, which here remains within Freud's formulation, into a seemingly diametrically opposite direction when he defined the superego as the, we all know, imperative of jouissance. This definition can open the space for what we can name the third paradigm of the superego, which is a consequence of Lacan's radical reformulation of the concept of jouissance. In short, if at the level of Seminar 7, Lacan posited a disjunction between the subject of the signifier qua speaking being and jouissance, which he placed at the level of the inaccessible thing, then through the detour of the fragmented jouissance of partial drives in Seminar 11 and the surplus jouissance of Seminar 16 and 17 as the one that emerges out of the renouncement of enjoyment, he introduced in Seminar 20 the concept of the jouissance of blah blah, or the so-called jouissance, the other satisfaction, which emerges precisely in the place of the structurally missing and at the same time prohibited primal limitless jouissance. We could say that in the reformulations of the jouissance between Seminar 7 and Seminar 17 and 20, the passage from subjective to systemic jouissance takes place. Within the conception of Lacan's earlier phase, in which the subject as a subject of the signifier and jouissance are in the relation of mutual exclusion, jouissance is inaccessible to a speaking being, access to jouissance is possible only through a subjective transgression of prohibition. As opposed to this, the surplus jouissance in Seminar 17 is a systemic jouissance, a couple of quote-unquotes from the seminar, an eruption of falling into the field, precisely through the gap, a hole in the discourse, which is the place of the representation of the lack of jouissance. So, as we all know, the plus de jour means at the same time enjoyment which takes the place as a surplus at the place of no more enjoyment. Means both enjoyment, surplus enjoyment and no more enjoyment. So, the superego as so in seminar 20, superego as the imperative of jouissance is related precisely to this reformulation of jouissance, which is in a way, how should we say? It relates to the prohibited jouissance, which is at the same time revalorized and swallowed up by the discourse itself in the form of surplus jouissance. Nevertheless, we should add here what I'm trying to develop in this kind of my main point. A fourth step, a fourth paradigm of the superego, for it seems that this impossible synthesis of the prohibition and guilt that generates the sense of guilt gets resolved precisely in the fourth step, which actually completes the logic of superego, at least in my reading. Through self-instrumentalization in this fourth step, the subject is established as a pure means of transgression, that is as an object of jouissance of the other, which this self-instrumentalization being possible precisely when the dirt of transgression, the dirt that is usually related to jouissance as such, assumes the form of necessity. And we could call this transition the completion of the logic of the superego in perversion. In perversion, stricto sensu, in strict sense, the subject gets rid of the sense of guilt through the self-instrumentalization, insofar as it truly perceives itself as a mere instrument in the hands of the other. Guilt for jouissance or transgression is here quite literally, I would say, transformed into a sign of virtue, or perhaps elevated to the status of thing, just as the immerse in the dirt of jouissance and transgression appears as necessary. And it is precisely in this prohibition that transgression of the law becomes indistinguishable from its preservation, as Giorgio Agamben would have put it, for example, in his theory of the state of exception. Or to quote Todd McGowan, through the superegoic imperative, one can promise followers unrestrained enjoyment while assuring them that one is restoring law and order. And the pure example of this fourth paradigm of the superego can be found obviously in Heinrich Himmler's famous speech to SS officers in Posen in October of 1943, which McGowan recounts in his paper. Himmler says, I quote, "We have the moral right, we have the duty to our people to do it, to kill these people who wanted to kill us. But we do not have the right, and this is the most important, to enrich ourselves with even one fur, with even one mark, with even one cigarette, with one watch, with anything." End of quote. As McGowan correctly emphasizes, the logic of exterminating European Jews in concentration camps was the following. In order to commit the greatest atrocities was conditioned, so the order to commit the greatest atrocities was conditioned by the renouncement of personal subjective jouissance. SS officers are ordered to exterminate the Jews under the condition of not personally profiting from these acts by, for example, stealing the Jews' personal property. The guilt for the actions was not only expressly transformed into virtue, but thereby itself became a source of special jouissance. And this speech continues, as we all know. I quote again, most of you will know what it means when 100 bodies lie together, when there are 500, or when there are 1,000. And to have seen this true, and with the exception of human weakness, to have remained decent, has made us hard, and is a page of glory never mentioned and never to be mentioned. And end of quote, we can call it this, obviously, like enjoyment of sacrifice for a greater good in a nutshell. In fact, in this part of his speech, Himmler seems to precisely formulate the difference between subjective and objective jouissance and the two related types of transgression, subjective and objective necessary transgression on the other hand. While the first one, the subjective transgression, is for him a sign of human weakness, the second, that is necessary and justified transgression in his view, is for him inherently related to decency and therefore the object of glory. Precisely in this form, where objective, necessary transgression, whose fundamental feature is the renouncement of one's own subjective jouissance, appears as a sign of highest morality. To quote unquote again, we have the moral right, we have the duty to our people to do it. The transgression of the law and its violation becomes, as Agamben claimed, for the state of exception, completely indistinguishable from its preservation. Or, again, in McGowan's words, the Nazis who are participating in the extermination are moral subjects according to Himmler. They follow the imperative of the superego even when it puts them at odds with the law. The glory lies in their ability to break the law without losing touch with morality. In short, Himmler objectivized the dirt related to extermination. Recall Agamben's remark regarding the final solution and Hitler saying that Jews should be exterminated, quote, as lies, into a duty. So he raises it to the level of necessity, and this type of transgression becomes a sign of virtue precisely under the condition of the executioners of the Holocaust, renouncing subjective personal jouissance. And like I try to condense this as much as possible, and let me now move to the video example. Just maybe a couple of words prior that I ran the video about the Chicago PD series for all those who are unfamiliar with it. It depicts a kind of a special unit of 21st District of Chicago Police Department. Is a kind of special intelligence unit ran by Sergeant Hank Voigt, who is an experienced police officer with a special history. He was released from the prison under the condition that he becomes, for his supervisors, the informer of other dirty cops within the Chicago Police Department. And running this special unit would be kind of only a cover-up for his actual role being the informer, while he's trying to present himself as a kind of loyal, decent police officer who is playing out constantly his supervisors, and basically the underlying plot of the story is his supervisors trying to remove him, but the only thing that changes during the seasons are the supervisors. So he is the one who is trying to, who actually succeeds in removing his supervisors. And most importantly, he's as I will try to show by running this video, he's trying to remove with a precise discursive strategy to distinguish between what I was trying to delimitate between subjective personal enjoyment on the one hand and professional objective enjoyment on the other. What he, the thing that with which he constantly burdens up his supervisors is, you are trying to remove myself only for your personal subjective interest, not for objective loyalty to for example, police badge. And this is also the main discursive argument with which he justifies his constant violations of not only police rules, but all set of legal prohibitions. And yeah, a couple of sentences just to give you a background for the video. The black supervisor just bribed the witness that so she can incriminate Voigt for a murder he actually committed a couple of seasons before. And he just called him, informing him, like, we have new witness who is going to incriminate you. It's better for you to resign and to go to jail for a couple of years so we can get rid of you. Here we cannot ignore, first of all, the comic aspect of the dialogue in which the tables are turned. Woods, who just moments before rejoiced the victory over Voigt, is suddenly arrested, while Voigt, who was just moments ago faced the threat of going to jail, avoids that and victoriously leaves the scene. But in addition to this comic aspect, there is something much more essential at work in this dialogue. Voigt formulates in almost every detail what I'm trying to develop under the name of the completion of the superego dialectic of dirty and necessary imperversion, which happens precisely at the moment when the transgression of Jouissance itself, which at the first has the form of the dirty, assumes the form of necessary. For Voigt explicitly says that the essence of his work is the transgression of the law. He says literally, we are the ones who are going the extra mile. One that leads to the liquidation of criminals with illegal violence, so it lies in, obviously, the gray area of the suspension of legal order that Agamben names the state of exception. This great gray area is related to dirt, and whoever enters it, by definition, dirties their hands. But Voigt adds something essential to it. The necessity of transgression rests directly on the renouncement of personal, subjective jouissance, which he ascribes to Woods. Woods' transgressions are unacceptable for Voigt precisely because they involve the jouissance of Egos Wood. Voigt's transgressions, on the other hand, are rather transgressions of a self-instrumentalized subject that renounces immediate subjective jouissance, which of course brings him more surplus jouissance. Put differently, from Voigt's perspective, the renouncement of personal subjective jouissance is the one that legitimizes the necessity of transgression, that transforms the jouissance of transgression and related dirt into a sign of virtue, or almost he elevated this to the level of thing. And just briefly in the conclusion, I would... Peter? Am I already over, right? 3 minutes, okay. So I'd like to nevertheless conclude by saying that during Donald Trump's presidency, Voigt's perversion, that is the disubjectification of guilt and the objectification of transgression, to the transformation of the dirt of jouissance into its necessity, again massively moved to the streets of US cities. Recall, for example, the case of shooting at the protests against police violence toward the black population in Kenosha, Wisconsin on 25 August 2020. In that case, the 17-year-old Kyle Rittenhouse of Illinois, a fervent supporter of Donald Trump and white supremacy, responded to the call of the local civilian militias in Kenosha to come and defend the city from the protests of its black inhabitants, who protested against, the protest was against the killing of a black man by the local police. The local militias called their supporters from other cities to come to Kenosha and help them defend small business owners from alleged black looting and rioting. That was actually nothing else but the call to establish once again, back again, law and order, which the local police was supposedly unable to secure. Rittenhouse went to Kenosha armed with a semi-automatic rifle and at the protest shot and killed two protesters and severely wounded one. It is merely a coincidence that all three victims of Rittenhouse shooting were white people who, in the political sense, in that moment occupied the same position as black people. It is not insignificant that, but now the trial is over and he was found not guilty on all counts. But during the trial, Rittenhouse did not plead racist motives for his shooting. So he did not declare that the black protesters and their white supporters are inferior beings that deserve to die, but claimed he acted in quote-unquote self-defense, and the whole defense of Rittenhouse in the court was with the argument of the self-defense, and it's during the trial it was totally symptomatic that the judge didn't allow to state attorneys accusing Rittenhouse to name protesters, so the killed protesters victims. The judge only allowed to call them rioters and looters, because calling them a victim would somehow prejudge for the jury the verdict. If they are called victim, he, by definition, has to be guilty. And like I said, the jury reached the verdict of not guilty on all counts, including the fourth one of the first-degree intentional homicide, and we can add to the argument that the argument of the self-defense could only succeed at the backdrop not only of systemic racism in US society, which also includes the judicial branch of the power, but also on discursive difference between systemic, in that case called by the court innocent jouissance, and subjective jouissance. And just to conclude, the events of the 6th January 2021 on Capitol belong to the same line and the logic of transgression. The group of Trump supporters considered themselves to be precisely the protectors of law and order and not the putschists. Hence, the absence of any guilt, symbolic or legal. The role of conspiracy theories such as QAnon is not unimportant here. The idea this theory is based on is precisely the idea of the transgression of subjective jouissance. The world is run by a pedophile network of private interests, opposed to which the transgression of the law, stretching from white militias patrolling the streets of the US cities to the occupation of the Capitol, appears as objectively necessary and indistinguishable from the preservation of law and order. The impossible synthesis of wilderness, the bison aspect, of and the law embodied in the image of Jake Agnelli on Capitol Hill on January 6 becomes possible, as Todd McGowan noted, with the super egoic politics of necessity of transgression. Thank you so much, and I apologize for the confusion in this talk.
Thank you, Boštjan. Any questions, comments? We still got 3 minutes. Yeah.
Thank you, Boštjan. I was wondering how you would suspend everything that you've said today against a certain very important comment that Lacan makes. Can you not hear?
A bit louder.
Yeah. So should I? Okay. Is this okay?
Yeah,
okay.
It's better.
At the beginning of Seminar 17, where he very clearly says that one never transgresses. Also, another comment that he makes, which is that the reason that we have a palpable sense of discourse and actually, therefore, discursive jouissance is the superego. How else would we account for something like the super?
Sorry, the second one?
Yeah. Is this okay?
Yeah. I just didn't got the second part of the question.
Basically, there is, to paraphrase, there's a discourse without speech that subsists by means of language because, or not because, but we have evidence of this by virtue of the superego. So and one way to think about it is that the discourse as such is the fact of the superego.
Yeah.
And that qua discourse without speech. And that, in particular, each discourse itself acts as a paradigm of jouissance. I mean, I think you can suspend it over, paradigm of the superego. You can suspend it over the material from Seminar 7 pretty well by, for example, noticing that a certain kind of superego, which is actually not the superego, is in the Master's discourse, just as it's in the supposition of a supreme good in Aristotle. By contrast, the maternal superego, which always demands more rather than demands that things work, also asks that we have a law which is compatible with it, therefore we still don't transgress everything, etc., etc. So I'm wondering how you might suspend everything you've said over the fact that we don't transgress anything, and whether perhaps the discourses are themselves a kind of solution. Thank you.
Yeah, to be honest, we can continue this later, because I'm not sure if I got you correctly. I think I got you correctly the first part. We do not transgress. I know it's a famous quote, Lorenzo Chiesa worked very much on this, when he says in Seminar 17, precisely, but it says in relation to surplus enjoyment. Surplus enjoyment is the one that drops into discourse in the whole of the no more enjoyment, so no transgression is needed anymore. The more, to put it in very simple terms, even if the one renounces the enjoyment, direct enjoyment, the enjoyment turns back to himself as a kind of boomerang in the form of surplus enjoyment. There is still enjoyment in renouncing the direct enjoyment. At the same time, I think it's in one of the last session of the Seminar 17, he still maintains the idea of another type, which is enjoyment of, in a very classical sense, I would, not necessarily in the sense of das Ding, but enjoyment which is prohibited. And he directly says the entire discourse is based on the prohibition of this immediate, we should say, full jouissance of full satisfaction. So one is jouissance in a classical sense, which is still prohibited. The discourse emerges as a kind of reaction to this impossible real jouissance. So you still have two types of jouissance in Seminar 17, and I don't think any contradictions to bring this together with the idea of the superego.
So if anybody has any questions, just quick, because we are already late, 2 minutes past our time. I do have some questions, but I don't want to impose now. All right. You ask for
Okay.
it. No, you're not. No. I have two associations, both coming from Hungary, 100 years apart, and one is coming from political left, the other from political right. The first is Lukács from 1919, speaking about necessary political involvement. So one has to dirty one's hands entering into politics, though this is the critics of Jouissance. And this is the problem for the left for the last 100 years, in a way. And the other is Orban, as John Keane, in his book New Despotism, recounts this anecdote. Somewhere in the 1980s or when Orban was still a little secretary of a little party, he stayed overnight at his friend's house, and the next morning the wife of his friend starts to polish his shoes. And he asks her, "What are you doing?" And she says, "I'm cleaning your shoes so one day I can tell the world that I cleaned the shoes for the Prime Minister of Hungary." And Orban takes her shoes and starts to clean them. And she asks, "What are you doing?" "I'm cleaning your shoes so one day you can say that the Prime Minister of Hungary cleaned your shoes."
Okay.
So the point is that somehow, well, there are many presuppositions in that. They are both confident that one day he's going to be a prime minister. And the other is that somehow he presents himself not as a dictator or tyrant, but doing that for the people. Self-instrumentalization is here. So if you have any ideas how to situate your talk in this relation, just a comment.
Okay. So
You don't have to. You're permitted not to.
okay, I will just take maybe a chance to remark you back very briefly, and say that you can, like in politics, approach many different phenomena with this schema. At the same time, my main concern is how to think Jouissance, or to put it differently, to think the law, because I'm not the one who would insist that because of the obscene other side, the dirty side of the law, which is the superego, we should suspend law altogether and install some, I don't know what. I think the task is how to think law without this super egoic supplement, to make a kind of detachment between the law and the super egoic detachment, which is impossible. At the same time, the thing that can bring structural changes and has structural consequences.
Thank you, Boštjan. So, thanks again.